There's probably no genre more ubiquitous with the 16-bit era than the fighting game, thanks in large part to quality home conversions of arcade hits like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. These games featured, aside from tight gameplay and control, big beautiful sprite artwork, amazing soundtracks, and their fair share of controversies, all elements that would ensure a burgeoning genre's popularity far into the future. Now, despite their dominance on 16-bit hardware, the majority of unlicensed and pirated fighting games came out on the NES and Famicom. This comes with not a few limitations to overcome, including fewer buttons, limited sprite capabilities and palettes, and simply less powerful hardware. As such, the consistency of quality across NES fighters is much less uniform than it is on the SNES or Genesis, ranging from almost unplayable, which is the case with Garo Densetsu 2 by Konisoft, to really damn good like with Hummer Team's The Legend and Garo Densetsu Special. Still, good or bad, these are NES fighting games we're talking about, and even with the most talented programmers piracy has to offer at the helm, those basic limitations of the system mean you can only do so much. With that understanding in mind, let's start talking about some of the few pirate SNES fighting games there are. And I say few, but the genre does account for a large portion of the SNES's pirate originals. The first game I played for this video was King of Fighters 2000, released exclusively to the South American market in 2000 by DVS Electronics. For future reference, DVS was likely responsible for all of the games we'll be looking at today. King of Fighters 2000, like its namesake, is a crossover fighter featuring characters from Fatal Fury and The Art of Fighting. However, this time a few other series are along for the ride, including XMen and Street Fighter. Now, unfortunately, the lack of Michael Jordan and Goku does put this a step under the so bad it's good gaming classic, Top Fighter 2000. But what we have here is still pretty great, and the addition of zombie clones for each character is at least something, I guess. Also, the game features 3-on-3 battles, a la Marvel vs. Capcom, which strengthens the crossover element greatly in my opinion. It's therefore a real shame that the game is just not fun, which is really a condemnation of the other fighters as well, since KOF 2000 is the most advanced and playable of all of them. The first sign that all is not well is that it's actually a 4 rather than a 6-button fighter. For whatever reason, the shoulder buttons go completely unused, giving you only 2 degrees of control for punches and kicks. A slight step up from the Famicom, but not by much, and in-game, the difference is really hard to discern. But that's minor in comparison to the real problems which stem from the game's core engine, which is shared across all games we'll be looking at. Frame rate, controls, and even the hitboxes of the characters, these are all areas where these games lack severely in quality. If you've been paying any attention to the screen, the frame rate problem should be obvious. It's choppier than a poorly delivered chopping analogy. Characters almost appear to teleport slightly rather than walk or jump. This accounts partially for why the controls are so bad, but I think it goes deeper honestly. By far the best way to get through the game is by using projectile attacks. You might think therefore that Ryu and his famous Hadouken move would make a good pick for your team. But this doesn't end up being the case as it turns out. The correct timing for the move is difficult enough, forcing me to adapt a somewhat painful rocking motion, which is really hard on my thumb. But on top of that, a mixture of what I can only assume are dropped inputs and lag leads me to pull off the almost always ineffectual uppercut move instead. This makes Cyclops the much better choice, since in a somewhat counterintuitive twist, he has fewer easy to perform moves, meaning you can shoot his laser at least somewhat more reliably than a Hadouken. Cyclops is also a good pick because his attack takes up a lot of the screen, which in some ways accounts for the extremely lackluster hit detection. Where punches and kicks will simply not connect sometimes, shooting off lasers over and over ended up being a really successful strategy. Naturally, the game becomes more than a little dull if you approach it like this, but at least it's playable. Otherwise, the enemy will quickly and unrealistically combo you into oblivion, especially on harder difficulties. Not that there's much incentive to play on harder difficulties anyway, since the ending is the same canned practice more to win screen. I think that about concludes everything there is to say about King of Fighters 2000, so let's briefly look at some of the others. Soul Edge vs. Samurai is a particularly bad example of the SNES fighting engine. This game, like the rest from here on out, are only 2-button fighters, which at that point you might as well just be playing those NES games I mentioned earlier. They might not be as colorful, but they're much better controlling and smoother. Nowhere is that more apparent, by the way, than with Soul Edge. Control is made nearly impossible thanks to the snail's pace the game runs at. Even walking becomes troublesome at this point. which is just kind of embarrassing. I found the best character to use was Hanzo, who has a completely broken and unavoidable pillar of fire at his disposal, if you can get the timing right. You'll have to apply that rocking method I mentioned earlier and put it into overdrive if you want a chance to beat it. And I do mean chance, since this game seems somewhat prone to freezing, something that sets it apart from the others. At the very least, it could be said that the ending is more substantial than KOF, but that's not saying much. Moving on. The original Street Fighter X plus Alpha is not a game I'm all that familiar with. From first impressions, it seems like Capcom's response to Virtua Fighter, but I don't know for sure. The unofficial SNES port doesn't really retain that feeling, but in terms of some of the sprite art and character selection, it stays truer to its source material than anything else we've seen so far. I was even able to pull off a rather unimpressive super move, though totally on accident. The only other element of note here, aside from a strangely difficult final boss, even on the easiest settings, is the feeling that this game has more gravity than the others. I can't tell for sure, but it seems like moves like the Shoryuken don't give you as much vertical height as usual. Tekken is another series I haven't really dug into very deeply, so maybe that's part of it, but I found Tekken 2 completely incomprehensible. I think the issue stems from the blocking system, the mechanics of which still elude me. The CPU was able to make pretty good use of it, but I couldn't for the life of me. This one I just truly had to muddle through to the end. The game's also kind of ugly, lots of very drab colors. That's something that can be said of fighters on the NES as well, but it's less forgivable here given the SNES's far superior color palette. Maybe if you're a Tekken fan you could get something out of it, but honestly I doubt it. Lastly, we have XMen vs. Street Fighter, which I was going to call the smoothest looking game, but upon review of the footage again, I think it just runs faster. Everything is as choppy as always, but it's sped up. I was most looking forward to this one at the start of my journey, since I really enjoyed the Marvel vs. Capcom games, and this is a precursor to those. Of course, it suffers from all the aforementioned engine-related issues, and thus can't really be enjoyed in any real capacity. So, you may have noticed I've avoided talking about sound and music for this entire review. Fighting games can at times live or die by sound, whether that's in terms of music or the sound effects themselves, like the whoosh and following crack when a punch lands, or the discharge of a laser beam. So on the whole, how do these games fare in this regard? Need I say more? When Cyclops' laser sounds like he just shattered Grandma's china on the dining room floor, you have a problem. Well, that's kind of a bummer, isn't it? It's not often that we feature such a concentration of underperformers in a single video, and unfortunately, this is sort of representative of the SNES pirate library as a whole. On a later video, we'll explore this in more detail, but DVS was also seemingly involved with a handful of platform games, including what might just be the worst game on the system. But as I said, that's for another time. For now, let's reflect on the unfortunate lack of decent unlicensed fighters, a concept that just didn't work on the SNES for some reason. And not for lack of trying either. Even as recently as 2017 you have new attempts like Unholy Knight, another completely botched effort made doubly disappointing by its crowdfunded nature and pedigree of ex-SNK staffers who gave the project a false air of quality. At the very least, the games we covered today had the appeal of familiar characters. Unholy Knight has almost nothing going for it. Well, that is aside for some wonderfully broken English. Wrong time and wrong place. How come you try to shop me? Grr, I have been wait for long years. It seems that for the foreseeable future, at least, the Famicom will have to remain my console of choice for unlicensed fighters. Disappointing maybe, but that's where they're most needed anyways. The SNES already has innumerably many great licensed fighters to choose from. And sure, Ryu can't fight Cyclops in any of those, but go for a few rounds in new challengers, and I think you'll find the gameplay more than makes up for it. Thanks for sticking around, everybody. My name's Mike the Gamer Guy, and I'd greatly appreciate it if you could leave me a like, a comment, outlining your thoughts on the topics discussed or just the video itself, and if you feel so inclined, hitting the subscribe button so that you never miss a moment of my rambling about subpar games from around 2 decades ago. If you want to support the channel financially, I have a Patreon for just that, with a link in the description below. Thanks again, everybody, and I hope to see you next time.